She came off the train at Dunmore with one trunk and the address written in her own hand on a folded piece of paper. The station was smaller than she'd expected. One platform, 2 benches, a station master who didn't look up when she stepped down. The town beyond the platform was the kind of town that had been put together quickly and hadn't bothered to change since. A hardware store, a feed merchant, a hotel with a sign that had faded to near illegibility. The mountains were visible from the street. They were not beautiful to her yet. They were simply there, large and indifferent, the way new things often are before you've had time to learn them. She folded the paper back into her coat pocket and picked up her bag. The address belonged to a man named Callum Ray. She had corresponded with him twice, once to answer his notice in the paper, once to confirm her arrival date. The letters had been practical. He needed someone to manage the house. She needed the work. Neither of them had pretended otherwise. She found the hardware store and asked the man behind the counter. "Ray," he said without much expression. "North of town. About 4 miles. You have a way to get there?" She said she didn't. He thought about it for a moment, then told her that Fergus Haddon ran a freight wagon most mornings and might take her as far as the turnoff if she asked him before noon. She thanked him and went back outside. Haddon was easy enough to find, a wide, quiet man loading timber onto a flatbed near the mill. He agreed to take her without a fuss, and she sat up front with him for 40 minutes while he drove north along a road that had been cut through timber country, the trees close on both sides, the sky a narrow gray strip above the treetops. "You know Ray?" he asked once. "Not personally," she said. Haddon didn't say anything else after that. He let her off at the fork where a narrower track turned east into the hills. She could see the roofline of a house about a 1/4 mile up, smoke coming from the chimney, thin and steady. She lifted her trunk from the flatbed, thanked him, and started walking. The man who answered the door was taller than she'd imagined from his letters. That was a strange thing to notice, that she'd imagined him at all. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away. Angular, weathered in the way that came from outdoor work. Eyes that assessed her and then moved to the trunk behind her and then came back. "Mrs. Fairley," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He held the door open and she came in. The house was larger inside than it looked from the track. A main room with a stone fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, 2 windows facing west, kitchen visible through a doorway. Stairs leading to what she assumed were the upper rooms. It was clean, more or less, but the kind of clean that came from a man who had tidied up once in anticipation of company and hadn't been in the habit before. She noticed the film on the window glass, the ash in the grate that had been pushed to the back but not removed, the stack of plates on the kitchen shelf with a crack running through the top one that he'd probably stopped seeing months ago. "Your room's upstairs," he said. "Second door." She followed him up. The room was small and had a single window facing north. There was a bed, a chest, a hook on the wall. It would do. "Supper's your concern," he said from the doorway. "I'll be in from the barn before dark." She set her bag on the bed and turned around. He'd already gone. She found the kitchen better stocked than she'd feared. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, a crock of lard, potatoes still good in a bin near the back door. He had a garden too, or the remnant of one, some late carrots still in the ground, a few stalks of something she couldn't identify until she pulled one and smelled it. Parsnip, she added it to the pot. He came in at dusk, shed his coat on the peg near the door, washed his hands at the basins. She set the pot on the table along with bread she'd found enough flour to make, and they sat across from each other without speaking. He ate steadily. She watched him the way she'd developed a habit of watching people. Not staring, just attending, noticing. His hands were something. She'd noticed them at the door, and she noticed them again now. A carpenter's hands, broad and scarred along the knuckles, the kind that moved with purpose even when they were still. "How long has the window in the kitchen been cracked?" she asked. He looked up. "Since spring," he said. She nodded. "I'll need putty and glass, unless there's a glazier in town." "There is. Aldous on the main street, past the hotel. I'll go in Thursday if you have no need of the horse." He said Thursday was fine. That was the most they spoke that first night. The week settled into a shape. She was up before him. She'd always been an early riser, one of those people who woke with a brain already moving, no gradual warming up. She had the stove going and water heated before she heard his boots on the stairs. He ate, went out, She worked the house. He came in at midday, sometimes didn't. She learned to leave something he could eat cold. In the evenings he read or worked on small repairs at the table, or sat near the fire in a way that suggested he was thinking about something, though she never asked what. She went to town on Thursday. Aldous Crane was a small, sharp-eyed man who seemed pleased to have a customer. He cut the glass while she waited and wrapped it in paper without being asked to. She bought the putty from the hardware store, and on the way back she stopped at the dry goods and bought wool. Not for any particular reason, just that she'd run out of her own months ago and her hands needed something to do in the evenings. When she replaced the kitchen window that afternoon, she did it by herself. She'd watched it done before, and the logic of it wasn't complicated. The hardened putty came away cleanly. The new glass went in straight. She pressed the fresh putty around the edges with a knife and smoothed it and stood back and looked at it, and it was fine. He came in from the barn before she'd put the tools away. He looked at the window. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You've done that before," he said. "Once or twice," she said. He hung up his coat. She'd lost her husband the previous winter. She didn't speak of it, and nothing in her manner invited questions, and he didn't ask. But she carried it the way you carry something heavy that you've been carrying long enough you no longer notice the weight, except at odd moments. When she laid 2 places at the table and her hands paused over the second setting, when she heard him come down the stairs in the early dark and her body, for just a second, expected a different sound, a different gait. She gave herself no patience for those moments. She moved on. The house improved steadily. It wasn't that she was ambitious about it. She was practical. She fixed what could be fixed. She cleaned what wanted cleaning. She organized the pantry in a way that made sense and restacked the wood beside the door, so the biggest pieces were at the back, and you could take what you needed without the pile shifting. She found a bucket with a cracked handle in the barn and replaced the handle with rope from the shed. It took 20 minutes. It was a better bucket after. He noticed these things. She could see that he noticed, though he didn't comment. He was not the kind of man who commented. But he had a way of pausing slightly in the doorway when he came in, like a man who is adjusting to something being different than it was. Like a man who is trying to decide whether the difference is welcome. She thought it probably was, but she left him to his own conclusions. In the 3rd week, she found the letters. She wasn't looking for them. She was cleaning the shelf above the fireplace, taking down the tins and the clock and the pair of worn gloves that had been sitting there since before she arrived, and behind the clock there was a stack of envelopes, held together with a bit of twine. They had been opened. She could see that 3 of them were in a woman's handwriting. She put them back behind the clock without reading them. She put the clock back in front of them. She put the tins back and the gloves back and went and got the broom. It wasn't her business, but it told her something. People left things in a certain order, in a certain place, for a reason. He hadn't thrown them out. He hadn't moved them. He'd covered them with a clock and a pair of gloves and continued to live around them the way you live around a bruise. Carefully, automatically, without having to think about it anymore. She understood that. In October, Mrs. Dewhurst came to call. She arrived in a wagon driven by her husband, who stayed in the seat while his wife came to the door. Mrs. Dewhurst was perhaps 50, with good boots and an observant manner and a loaf of brown bread wrapped in a cloth, which she presented at the door. "I'm the nearest neighbor," she said, 2 miles east. "I would have come sooner, but we've been putting up the last of the root cellar." She came inside without being invited, which seemed to be her way. She sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room with the frank appreciation of someone who had been in this house before and found it changed. "He had it in some state," she said. "It's a working house," she said. It wasn't a defense of him exactly. Just accurate. Mrs. Dewhurst looked at her with the directness of a woman who had been making assessments of other women for decades and was good at it. "Are you staying?" she asked. It was a plain question. She answered it plainly. "I expect so," she said. Mrs. Dewhurst seemed satisfied with that. She accepted a cup of tea and sat for half an hour and talked. About the winter coming, about the road, about a man named Harwick in the valley who had broken his leg felling a tree and whose wife was managing alone. She mentioned his name 3 times, and each time something in her manner suggested she was watching to see how it was received. She received it without reaction. When Mrs. Dewhurst left, she stood at the window and watched the wagon go back down the track and thought that word would be in town for Thursday. She found she didn't particularly mind. The first hard snow came in November. She'd been watching the sky for 3 days and had felt it the way she'd always felt weather. A pressure at the back of her neck, a change in the quality of light. She brought in extra wood, filled the water barrel, checked the latch on the barn door when he was inside at midday. "Storm coming," she said as she came back in. "I know," he said. "I brought the wood in." He looked at her for a moment. "I noticed," he said. "She made a thick soup that night with the last of the salt pork and the rest of the parsnips and some dried peas she'd found in the back of the pantry shelf." He ate 2 full bowls and didn't comment, but when he got up to put the bowl in the basin, he stopped in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room. "My wife was like that," he said, "with the weather." She looked at him. "She could feel it before it came," he said. 3 days out sometimes." He went to his chair by the fire. She stayed at the table for a moment, her hands around her cup, and looked at the doorway he'd just walked through. She hadn't expected that. The storm hit that night. She lay in her room upstairs and listened to it. The wind working around the eaves, the creak of the timber, the sound of snow hard against the north window. It was a good sound in its way. The particular comfort of being inside something solid while weather moved outside it. He started talking after that. Not much. Not in any way that was sudden or dramatic, but the quality of their evenings changed. He would say something about the timber contract he was waiting on, about a fence post that had heaved with the frost, about a letter he'd received from his brother in Manitoba. She would respond or she wouldn't, depending on whether she had something useful to add. He didn't seem to require the kind of conversation that was really just noise to fill a room. She was grateful for that. One evening, she was mending his coat at the table. She'd noticed the lining coming away from the collar. A small thing, but the kind that got worse in cold weather. And he was at the fire with a book, and neither of them was talking, and she was aware of the particular quality of that silence. It was not uncomfortable. It was not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who had found a way to be in a room together without requiring anything from each other, which is its own kind of thing. She tied off the thread and folded the coat. "Done," she said. He looked up from his book. "Thank you," he said. She set it on the back of his chair and went upstairs. She'd learned by then that he had taken on the house after his wife died. 3 years ago, from fever, in March, that the letters behind the clock were his wife's letters to him from the year before they were married, when she'd been in Ontario and he'd already come west. That he had placed the advertisement in the paper, not because he'd stopped grieving, but because the house had become something he could no longer manage alongside everything else. And he was a practical man, and practical men in difficult situations find solutions. She had not learned these things from him directly. You learn a person in pieces, slowly, the way you learn a landscape. Not by looking straight at it, but by moving through it. By noticing where it is soft and where it is hard. She had learned them from the way he handled certain objects, from what he never touched, from the dresses still folded in the cedar chest at the foot of the stairs that she'd opened once by mistake and closed immediately, from the way he stood some mornings at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked out at something that was not the yard. She didn't feel sorry for him. That wasn't the word. She recognized it, the particular shape of a loss you had started to build around, the way wood builds around a nail. Slowly, completely, changing its own structure to accommodate something that would not be removed. One afternoon in late November, his neighbor's boy came up the track on a horse, a boy of about 12, freckled and serious, named Darcy Flett. He had a message from his father. A section of the shared fence line had come down in the storm, and there was cattle getting through to the road. He went immediately. She watched him saddle the horse through the kitchen window. He was back at dark, mud on his coat, his hands cold when he came in. She had supper on the table. He sat down and ate before he said anything. 3 of Flett's steers got as far as the junction, he said. "We got them all. Any injuries?" "No." He looked at his hands. "The fence took some work." She refilled his coffee cup. He wrapped both hands around it. "Flett says his wife wants to have you for dinner before Christmas," he said. "If you'd like." She considered it. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded. She went to the flats for dinner on a Sunday in early December, and he drove her there and waited in the main room with Darcy and Darcy's father, while she sat in the kitchen with Siobhan Flett, who was a warm, direct woman with flour on her apron and 5 children ranging from the age of 3 to 17, and who talked about everything with the same easy frankness she applied to everything. They talked about the winter, about preserving, about where the nearest doctor was and how long the road was passable, about what she'd done to the Ray house, which Siobhan had evidently heard about from Mrs. Dewhurst and was curious about in a friendly, practical way. "And how is he?" Siobhan asked, meaning she thought about it honestly. "He's a quiet man," she said, "but not a difficult one." Siobhan nodded. "He was very bad after Agnes," she said, quietly, without making it a story. "The first winter, anyway," he managed. She didn't say anything to that, but she filed it. On the drive home, the road was dark, and the stars were very bright, and he said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "Flet's a good man." "His wife is good," she said. "Yes," he said. That was all. Christmas came with a cold that settled into the valley and didn't lift for 2 weeks. She made shortbread because she had the ingredients, and it was something her hands knew how to do without thinking. She set some on a plate on the table on Christmas morning and didn't make a point of it. He picked one up without comment, ate it, picked up another. "My mother made these," he said. "Mine too," she said. He looked at her briefly. She looked back. There was something in that. Not much, but something. The ordinary shock of discovering that 2 very separate lives had run, in small ways, in parallel. That the same December smell had been in 2 different kitchens, years apart on opposite sides of the country. She didn't make much of it. But she thought about it later, washing the dishes, while he was in the barn checking on the animals in the cold. The way a small thing can be a kind of proof that a person is not as foreign as they first appeared. That a house which was not your own house can begin to have familiar angles in it. He asked her to stay in January, not in those words exactly. He was not a man for those words. What he said was, "The arrangement, if it suits you, there's no reason it needs to be temporary." She finished the row before she answered. "It suits me," she said. He nodded. He went back to his book. She let the silence and come back into the room and settle, and she knitted another row, and outside the snow was falling again, light and steady, the way it had been falling for weeks, and the fire was good and the house was warm. And she thought that there were worse ways to start a thing than quietly. In winter, with the roads closed and the world reduced to something small enough to see clearly. She had not come here looking for anything beyond what she'd been offered. But sometimes a person finds themselves, gradually and without announcement, at home in a place they didn't choose. Not because the place is perfect, because they have made it work, and it has made room for them. And that exchange, carried out in small acts over cold months, had turned into something she didn't yet have a name for. She didn't need one yet. She kept knitting. He turned a page. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the snow fell on.